Next up on our trip through the Thurman family line is Jabez Thurman. Now, Jabez was born in Bedford County, Virginia around the year 1795. His childhood was not likely a whole lot of fun since he was the child of Joseph Thurman, who we talked about before. Joseph was a very violent and abusive man, and there's no reason to think that he was anything short of that as a father. Now, that didn't make a great deal of difference because he died when Jabez was 9 years old. And the courts down in Tennessee decided that it would be in everyone's best interest, Jabez's best interest for the most part, if he would be apprenticed out to a man named Pat Fitzgerald. And Mr. Fitzgerald was a tailor, and he pledged to teach Jabez the tailor's trade and also to learn him to read and write. Now, we have every reason to think Mr. Fitzgerald was a good man, and there is actually some evidence that he may have actually married Nancy and become Jabez's stepfather. And it's not all that unusual that later on we're going to find that Jabez named his first child Patrick after Mr. Fitzgerald. And anyway, as Jabez grew to be a young man, he lived there in East Tennessee, and we're going to see he'll always live in East Tennessee. He's an incredibly stable individual. But he caught the eye of a local girl, Miss Nancy Tipton. Now, the Tipton family was real big in those parts. And one of the most famous ones of all was Fightin' Billy. William Fightin' Billy Tipton, also known as Revolutionary Billy. He had been wounded and was disabled since the war, but still he was a venerable old man. And we believe he was Nancy's father. So anyway, Jabez obviously stood high in old Billy's eyes because he got some land granted to him. It was right near the Tipton home in what's called Cades County, Tennessee. Now, Cades County today is a very beautiful place. It's a state park, and they even have a house from back in those days that is called the Tipton House. And it wasn't Billy's house, but it was one of the close family members to the Tiptons. Now, they didn't live there a whole long time, but they did start raising their family. As I mentioned before, Patrick was their first, around 1820. And then shortly thereafter came a young fellow named Joe, named after Joseph, his father. Now, Joe is a man that is my great-great-great-grandfather, and we'll talk about him a lot because he was a very colorful fellow, and we have a lot of good stories and tales to tell about Joe. But that's for another day. For now, we're going to finish up talking about Jabez, because after Jabez had a couple of kids, he moved off to Knoxville, to a farm about 4 miles south of Knoxville, where they lived for the rest of their lives. I say they because Nancy, she died right away. Around 1835, she died, and she left Jabez raising 8 kids by himself. And, of course, now he didn't really do that very well, so what he did was he got married again real quick to another Tipton girl. You'll see that the Thurmans and the Tiptons, tight family. So he marries Alcy Tipton, and she quickly gives him 2 more sons, young man Henry Carrick Thurman and then John Tyler Thurman. And unfortunately, much like modern families, these dynamics don't always work out too well. And Jabez's relationship with his older children started to fall apart. What happened first was that Patrick got himself in trouble fighting over a girl and had to leave home. And he ran off down to Texas, running from the law, and joined the Texas Army, what we call the Meyer Expedition. That's for his story. Also, there was Joe. We have a notation, very unfortunate notation, in the church records there in Knoxville, talking about how Joe and Jabez could not get along. They had a big fight, and Joe removed to Missouri. And of course, by that time, Joe was married to this Tipton girl, and they had themselves a little family going. And the good news is that relationship repaired itself through the years, and even though Joe never returned to Tennessee, he and Jabez did maintain correspondence throughout his life, and For all we can tell, they remained close. And in fact, the Thurmans, very close family, very clannish, as some people might have said. Now, Jabez spent his life raising those children. And he watched them leave home one by one. And he watched them go off in the military. He had a young boy named Reuben. Reuben went off to the Mexican War in 1847. But he did come home safe. He had a regiment from Tennessee. And he went down and he fought with Scott's army. He came home safe, but then the Civil War broke out a few years later. And Jabez had 3 sons, Henry Carrick, John Tyler, and Reuben, that all went off and joined in the military. And they fought for the Union because, you see, Jabez never owned slaves. And in that part of East Tennessee, there was a lot of sympathy for the federal position. And they had a regiment from East Tennessee that they joined in, that Henry Carrick joined for certain. A very active regiment in the western part of the Civil War. And they fought against the South. In other words, they fought against a lot of their neighbors. But they fought against slavery, and that's something I'm very proud of. Now, the war years was tough on Jabez. Jabez and Alcee, they were getting old by that time. They were in their 60s. And they had all these families of their sons had to come live with them. One in particular was Lucinda. Lucinda Thurman was married to Henry Carrick. And there's a lot of letters and correspondence we're going to talk about later on that went on between those two. But one of the things we find out, and it's kind of a cute thing to find out, kind of nice, is that even during the war they planted crops and they had great success. And they had peaches and they had corn, they ate the corn and all that. But they also had these peaches. And each summer we see in the letters between Lucinda and Henry Carrick that she's trying to tempt him into coming home and visiting her by telling him all about how good the peaches are and how many peach pies they have for everybody to come eat. And they use that to tempt the soldiers. But the war did have a sad side for Jabez. He lost Henry Carrick right toward the end, and of course the farm was plundered, and they spent some overall lean times. But it did come to an end. And by that time, Jabez was turning 70 years old. Now, you'd think that he was probably just about near the end of his life, but it wasn't true. Jabez lived another 26 years after that, and because he lived to be 96 years old. He lived it all right there in East Tennessee. Outlived 2 wives. Now, in his obituary notice in the local newspapers, what they say about Jabez is he was among the oldest citizens of Knox County, and he died at his home. He was an honest man, respected and esteemed by all his neighbors and by all who knew him. And I think that's important for us to have talked about Jabez, because the first story we talked about was Joseph. Joseph was his father, and Joseph was a violent man and obviously a bully who got in trouble. But not Jabez. Jabez was beloved. He was respected. And as far as we can determine, he was a good man throughout his life. And somebody to be proud of in the family tree. And that is where we'll leave him.